Welcome to the Democracy Podcast. I'm Henry.
And I'm Jesse.
And today we're going to talk about the reality of voter fraud in the United States. So Jesse, today we're talking about voter fraud. This is something that's really interesting to me. Unlike gerrymandering, what we talked about in our last episode, voter fraud is like fundamentally, at least wide-scale voter fraud, is not a real issue in American society. But in the last 5 years, and especially in the last 8 or 9 months, have become like a really common and persistent topic of conversation in American politics. So do we want to just jump right in and talk about, over the last few decades, what's the reality of voter fraud in America?
Yeah, so when you look at the last few decades and try to look at, okay, what is the evidence that is out there of voter fraud? There was a big 2014 comprehensive study that was published in the Washington Post, among other places, that saw that there were about 31 identifiable cases of voter fraud. And they were looking from 2000 through 2012, like all of the elections that happened there. And they estimate about 1 billion ballots would have been cast between all of those elections, if you include primary, special elections, general elections, all that good stuff. And it's also something that has very much been looked at by a lot of people who want to prove that voter fraud is happening. So a lot of people may not remember this, but the George W. Bush administration also spoke a lot about concerns of voter fraud and fears around that. And Republican activists in the 2000s talked a lot about voter fraud and Acorn and all these different weird schemes that Democrats were supposedly using to win elections at that time. And so they actually launched a 5-year voter fraud investigation under the Bush administration that turned up virtually no evidence of organized fraud. So of some large group coordinating substantial amounts of fraud to benefit a particular party. And in total, there are about 86 criminal convictions that came out of that investigation. And many of those appear to have been linked to people misunderstanding some of the rules or filling out paperwork incorrectly, rather than people very intentionally double voting or voting when they knew they were ineligible to vote.
If you take a look at, 1 billion ballots being cast, naturally, a very small percentage of those are going to involve human error, misunderstanding. My math here is that if those numbers in the Washington Post study are correct, 31 fraudulent cases, I'm assuming that's ballots. That may not actually be the case. That might be 31 instances of voter fraud. But if we're assuming that it's ballots, that means that of the billion votes cast, 0.00000031% of votes cast involved fraud. That's 8 zeros.
Yeah, for sure. And that is definitely, that's definitely a ridiculously low number. And now, of course, that's, maybe the low end estimate. I found a database by the Heritage Foundation. Now, the Heritage Foundation, very right-leaning organization, one of the oldest right-wing think tanks out there. So they're clearly, they're not unbiased in this. They're trying to show evidence of voter fraud. And they had about 1,300 instances that they said were voter fraud. I wasn't able to review each of them individually. And that's from the 1992 election through, I believe, the 2018 election. So even at that, that's probably,
maybe 7 zeros after the decimal place. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably, 1.5 billion to 2 billion ballots cast in that time. and at most 1,300 instances of fraud spread out over that entire period. And so the point here is that voter fraud is incredibly rare when we actually look at the last few decades and look at what the best evidence that's out there that suggests and has looked at this. It's not something that is happening on a scale that is going to affect very many elections. And the elections that would be affected are primarily those small local elections. Because, for an alderman race or a city council race in a mid-sized city, a few dozen ballots really could make the difference. Some of those elections have a few hundred voters. Like I know in the city of Annapolis in Maryland, their primary elections are coming up and they get a few hundred votes in those elections in total, typically. So it could potentially affect very small local elections, but at a presidential level, the closest election ever was decided by 500 votes in 2000. And of course, that election was won by Republicans at the time. So certainly unlikely that any Democrats were involved in creating fraud in that election. And outside of that example, every presidential election is, decided by tens of thousands of votes. So you really would need a substantial organized fraud effort to influence them.
Yeah, if you're uninformed on the actual numbers, I think like looking at Florida in the 2000 presidential election or Washington State's 2004 gubernatorial election, where the Democrat won by 129 votes, that those elections are really close. But if you look at that, even take the Heritage Foundation number without any scrutiny, like that's over several election cycles across 50 states. And there's no way that any of those big elections would have been influenced pushed over the edge one way or another by those 1,300 votes. They're just spread out all over the place. And if you look into like the Heritage Foundation reporting, there's no claim of increased voter fraud in districts or in places where the election is already really close. It's like this spread of votes over a very long period of time over a lot of different districts and precincts and counties and states. And there's just no way that those votes could have, impacted even these really, really tight, important elections, let alone like the 2016 or 2020 presidential elections.
And as far as I know, I've looked for this explicitly and have not found anything of this nature that would be like, here's a case for why this election in the last 20 years was impacted or may have been impacted by voter fraud. Like, here's what we know, here's how close it was. I haven't seen anyone make a compelling case, with the one exception being the North Carolina 2018 congressional election there, where there actually was a sort of election fraud scheme discovered, where a Republican operative, someone working for Mark Harris, the Republican candidate, was sending people to collect absentee ballots, and they were collecting them, even though you're not allowed to do that in North Carolina. They were also collecting them unsealed, unfinished. There's some suggestion that they were filling out ballots that were not completed. And so it wasn't voters themselves committing fraud. It was campaigns or
you're telling me a Republican campaign.
Yes, a consultant for a Republican campaign conducted some level of fraud. And given that that was a very close race in 2018, they ended up not certifying the results of that election. And there was a special election, which the Republican was a different Republican candidate who ran in the special election, but they still won that seat in the end anyway. But yeah, so that is like one of the biggest instances that has been discovered where it could have been, oh, this impacted a actual election result in this case. But that is not what people typically think of or are describing when they're talking about voter fraud. And of course, most notably, like that was discovered and the election results were rejected in that case. And yeah, you saw a lot of good reporting into that. There was a lot of attention. And I think that also shows another important thing, which is that the media really does want to find examples of voter fraud. Like there's a great incentive if you can do that, because it's something that gets a lot of focus, especially in election years. And so if you can break a case and be like, hey, there was this voter fraud in this one election and it could have, impacted the results, or here's what we know about it, like that would be a huge story to break.
It could be the biggest story of the year. Yeah.
Oh yeah. If someone found like an actual like thousands of votes impacted voter fraud story, that would be like a major impact. And the takeaway there is just that like people are looking for this very hard, and they're finding what happened in North Carolina and finding one-off instances here and there, but they're not finding consistently or finding large-scale operations of voter fraud like you would need to actually sway elections in the US that are larger than, very local elections.
Let me play devil's advocate here. If you're not buying into conspiracy theories in 2020, which we're going to talk more about 2020 in a little bit. But in theory, technology has advanced the point in 2020 where, we're having secure elections. But throughout the course of American history, surely there's been examples of voter fraud. We've had elections for 300 years. There's so many opportunities, especially before computers and before digital ballots and security checks. Can you tell us about any historical examples of voter fraud?
So if you go back all the way to like the 19th century, various forms of voter fraud were probably pretty common. There was a long time when we didn't have the secret ballot, meaning people actually would take in a physical ballot. Parties would often print them. And so you could know, who people were voting for. And that made a lot of vote buying schemes very common. And as recently as the 1948 Senate election that LBJ won, there's a lot of evidence that there were essentially just votes stuffed on at the end to get him to win the Democratic primary in that year. And it's one of the last major instances where not only is there good evidence of fraud, but that it probably changed the result of an election in a way that significantly impacted American politics. And basically my understanding is what they had there was just a chunk of votes that were counted late from one town or precinct. And they were all in alphabetical order, and they were all for LBJ. And someone came forward after LBJ had died and said he worked on that election and that it was fraud. And yeah, and so that was the 1948 Senate election. And then more recently, there have been prosecutions in Chicago in 1982 and Brooklyn in 1984. I think around 60 people, including local elected officials, precinct captains, were charged in the Chicago indictment. And those were essentially sort of like old school, like democratic machine politics that were engaging in voter fraud schemes where they were, registering people who shouldn't have been registered, paying people off for votes, things like that. But there's really been no evidence since 1984 of anything like that happening. And again, in both of these instances, the level of voter fraud might have been enough to affect some of the local elections, but not the presidential level. And they were prosecuted, like there was significant investigations and prosecution in those cases. And nothing like that has been identified in like the last 37 years now.
These dirty Democrats have a habit, apparently, of doing some dirty machine election rigging in the past. So sell me on, maybe there weren't 3 million fraudulent votes cast in 2020, but why should I believe that our most recent presidential election was not stolen from President Trump by a massive coordinated effort to swing the election through voter fraud? Besides what we've already talked about, that there just isn't any evidence of it.
Yeah, so let's take a look at 2020 specifically. And so I'm going to start with the director of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So during the 2020 election and for a few days afterwards, Chris Krebs held that position. I believe he was the first person to ever hold that position because it had been created under the Trump administration to work on cybersecurity issues. And there was a lot of concern of cyber attacks on our elections. And he's someone who's been a lifelong Republican. He was appointed by Trump himself, unanimously approved by the Senate. Here's what he had to say about the November 3rd election. He said, the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes or changed votes or was in any way compromised. So that
pretty strong statement.
So that is Chris Krebs, and he's someone who worked in the Trump administration, someone who would have a lot of incentive to not say that because he was actually fired by Trump for making that statement, essentially, because that didn't go along with what Trump said. Then we also have other statements by other major Republican officials who had investigated this or were looking at it before the election happened. We have Christopher Wray, the FBI director, who said, we have not seen historically any kind of coordinated national voter fraud effort in a major election, whether it's by mail or otherwise. And then Bill Barr, the former attorney general, to date, DOJ investigators have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election.
That was on December 1st, 2020.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was after they'd been looking at it, after Trump's claims of voter fraud had been out there for several weeks after the election. And then we also have state level officials. So the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, he is in charge of the election in Georgia, and he found there's no evidence of fraud. He conducted multiple recounts that did not change the results or discover fraud. And he said the claims in the Kraken lawsuit proved to be as mythological as the creature for which they're named. Georgians can now move forward knowing their votes, and only their legal votes were counted accurately, fairly, and reliably. And the Kraken lawsuit was a lawsuit brought by Trump affiliates. I believe like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani were involved with that, claiming that, there's this major voter fraud. Now, in 2020, of course, there were some real cases of voter fraud discovered. One example is a man named Bruce Bartman voted on behalf of his dead mother in Pennsylvania for Donald Trump. Yes. Yeah. So he didn't, he's not a Democrat, obviously. Not that that really matters for establishing how much voter fraud is out there. But in this particular instance, this is a guy who's a Republican, and he essentially, requested an absentee ballot for his mother, who I believe had died recently and was still registered to vote, still on the voter rolls, and attempted to fill that out and bring it in. Now, one, he was caught and charged with a crime for that. And two, it's very interesting if you read why, like, his claims about why he did this. He's basically like, oh, I've been hearing all this stuff about how voter fraud and like Democrats are going to steal the election. So I was like, I should go and vote as much as I can, like vote illegally in order to like essentially outdo this Democratic voter fraud that I know is happening. So it's just very ironic that one of the few instances of confirmed voter fraud in the 2020 election was someone who was motivated to commit a voter fraud out of fear that the other side was going to commit voter fraud, when there's no evidence that the other side did commit any voter fraud.
Let's talk about that. So Bruce learned the hard way that dead people can't vote. Well, so if there's clearly, no real strong evidence of widespread or influential levels of voter fraud, why on earth have we been hearing since the election from Republican officials, news sources, that Trump had the election stolen from him? What is going on? What's up with all this Republican disinformation?
Yeah. Well, I think it all starts with Donald Trump himself. I'm not a psychologist, but Donald Trump seems like someone who is not very good at admitting when he's wrong, when he's lost, when he's made a mistake, mostly because you've seen him in public life for years now, and he never does any of those things. So most notably, Donald Trump himself claimed that there were 3 to 5 million illegal ballots in the 2016 election that he won. And he made that claim because he lost the popular vote in 2016. And so he wanted to say that, oh, I didn't really lose the popular vote. It was just Hillary Clinton got all these illegal votes for her, which is totally insane for two reasons. One, 3 to 5 million would be a massive, massive amount of fraud. That would be unbelievable to even attempt.
Orders of magnitude larger than anything that's ever happened.
Yes. And then two, why would you commit so much fraud and then lose the election? Like, why would any Democrat be like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to have a bunch of fraudulent ballots in California, even though we're definitely going to win California, but we're not going to have like 20,000 fraudulent ballots in Wisconsin that we might actually need. It makes absolutely no sense. But it goes to, what motivates Donald Trump and his claims around that. And it's clearly not accuracy. And also, Donald Trump himself, his administration set up in 2017 a commission to look at voter fraud, ostensibly headed by Mike Pence, but really Chris Kobach was, I think, the de facto head. And it operated until early 2018 before it shut down without finding any evidence of voter fraud in the 2016 election. So Donald Trump's administration looked at this, the 2016 election, for months. They claimed there was voter fraud, but they never were able to come up with any evidence for that. That election is now 5 years ago, and there's still been no substantiated reports of significant voter fraud in the 2016 election. There are a lot of claims around various voting machines like the Dominion voting systems. And what's interesting there is, so they claim they were, owned by Democrats or somehow biased towards Democrats. The reality is that these voting machine companies, they've made donations to both political parties and hired staffers from both political parties, but they're not owned by any prominent members of either political party. And those donations are, of course, common for any business that does a lot of business with the government.
And remind me, Dominion is a Canadian company, right? They're like based in Toronto or something. I think they have offices in California, but I believe that Dominion is not even like housed in the United States of America. It's like, like a nonpartisan country designing voting systems. That's not like China or Russia or something like really wild. They're like a Canadian company in Toronto that's clearly, would have a stronger investment or incentive to be involved in Canadian politics than like American politics.
There's nothing they've done really that is out of the ordinary for a voting system. And in fact, Georgia was one state that used them in 2020 for the first time. And part of the reason they did that is that the Dominion voting systems actually do have a paper backup. And some of the prior systems that have been used did not. And one of the number one things you want to protect against fraud is a paper backup or a paper ballot, because if it's just on a machine, machines can be hacked, they can be changed, and there's no way to go back and audit and verify that unless you have those paper backups that you can count by hand. And actually, that's something that is still a problem, that we don't have 100% paper ballots, but something that got a lot better. Yeah, Chris Krebs actually talked about that, and 95% of votes cast in 2020 had either a paper ballot or a paper backup, which is just like a printout of an electronic vote that prints out right when you cast it. Whereas that number was only 82% in 2016.
Whoa.
And the reason it's not 100% is that different jurisdictions get to set a lot of these rules, and some have been better than others about upgrading their systems. And you want to have a paper backup system, especially nowadays when one of the biggest risks is not people voting twice, but a foreign power or a corrupt political party or some other entity hacking voting systems. That's far more likely to shift the election results than your sort of old school voter fraud where someone votes twice or someone votes who isn't eligible to vote. But yeah, so that was one thing they exploited. And ultimately, all the people who claimed that Dominion voting systems was fraudulent, many of them have been sued for defamation, and most of them have backed off of their claims, like Newsmax and other organizations have backed off from claiming they have proof of fraud since they've been sued, because they know they can't actually defend that claim in court.
Yeah, I know, like the lawsuit is like $1.6 billion that Dominion filed against some of the people who are pushing. I know like Giuliani is involved in that lawsuit. I'm sure there are several, but it's like we're talking billions of dollars in defamation lawsuits, to the point where even like extreme right-wing sources like Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, was told on OAN that he had to start using the word allegedly before he was able to talk about voter fraud, because they were worried about being sued for a substantial amount of money. That I think that shows both that like the claims are so fraudulent that, Dominion suffered like serious financial consequences and is going to invest enough resources into funding a multi-billion-dollar defamation lawsuit. So they feel like they have strong standing, and anyone who is pushing that claim is backing way off.
And Trump and others have also looked at, other things that were super expected to try and say they were evidence of fraud. Like a big thing was there was a late shift towards Biden in a number of states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, where as the votes were counted early on, Trump was leading by a lot, and then that his lead eventually disappeared altogether.
That's got to be
but
fraud.
That was, yes, that's what they're claiming. They're like, oh yeah, got to be fraud. You can't ever have one person leading when you start counting the votes and another person leading once you've counted all the votes.
I think they stuffed the ballot box.
Clearly, yes. Now, the reality, of course, is that what was happening, which everyone had known about at the time, had been widely reported for weeks and months beforehand, was that Biden voters were much more likely to vote by mail. And the reason for that is that historically, there'd never been a difference, or not a substantial difference, between Democrats and Republicans voting by mail. But Trump himself was like, voting by mail is fraud. Don't do it. Vote in person. It's fraud. Da, da, da. So that led to a lot of Republicans voting in person.
And Democrats just objectively, Democratic voters were objectively, we've seen it in survey after survey, were more likely to take the pandemic seriously and social distance. And one way that you could have done that was, instead of waiting in line with a bunch of other people, you could request an absentee ballot and mail it in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Democrats were generally, this entire time, have been more concerned about COVID-19 and the pandemic. And so they were like, yeah, I'm going to vote by mail so that I don't have to go in person and, potentially be around others when I am voting. And so what that meant is that absentee ballots were overwhelmingly Democratic, whereas in-person votes were much more Republican. And in those three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they were not allowed to start counting absentee ballots until Election Day, I believe. And that meant that they did not get a lot of those ballots counted. And also, absentee ballots are a lot slower to count, simply because you have to take them out of an envelope first. So it's like someone is physically removing all of these envelopes and like processing them, whereas an in-person vote is not in the envelope. So you're just sliding it into the machine and you're good. So it takes longer to count those absentee ballots, and they were not allowed to count them before Election Day. And so that meant it took hours to, in some cases, days to get all of those counted. And so you saw a bunch of Biden votes coming in late rather than the other way around. And ironically, if you just had laws that allowed those ballots to be counted as soon as they arrive, because most of those ballots had actually been cast, days, weeks ago, but they just hadn't been counted until Election Day, you would have seen the opposite effect. You would have seen, wow, Biden's up big. And I think that actually happened a little bit in Ohio, where they were faster at counting those absentee ballots, because you saw Biden leading in the state of Ohio early on, and everyone was like, oh my God, is this going to be a big upset? In the end, no, Trump won Ohio by 8 points. And that was kind of expected. Ohio's become a lot more red-leaning relative to the nation last couple of election cycles. So that is why that happened. Also, big cities, which are dominated by Democrats, tend to vote tend to be slower at counting their votes, just because there's so many people packed into this one area. So like there was a big swing toward Biden at like 3 a.m. in Wisconsin, and it was because a huge batch of ballots from Milwaukee all got reported out at one time, and Milwaukee is heavily Democratic. There have also been a bunch of audits that have happened since then. Now, one, election officials have a bunch of different ways they standardly check election results. Recounts are very frequent. There were 3 recounts in Georgia. There was a recount in an audit in Maricopa County in Arizona. And those were all sort of following standard procedure to make sure, nothing was amiss in those elections. But even though none of those found anything, the Republican-controlled state Senate in Arizona decided that there, was still more to investigate about the election, despite the fact that there were no remaining credible allegations of fraud, and that none of what the Maricopa County or other recounts, audits, or anything had found anything where it's like, oh, this is suspect, we need to look into this further. So they ended up launching an audit. And what is very interesting about this audit is that it's clearly not designed to be a credible audit to get to the bottom of what happened. So first off, they hired this firm called Cyber Ninjas. That one is called Cyber Ninjas. So you're starting off poor there. I don't want an audit firm to ever be called Cyber Ninjas. Like, that should never be involved in auditing. You need to be a boring name to audit people. I'm sorry, that's the rules. If I'm going to trust your audit results, you've got to be like the Election Integrity Investigation Unit or something like that. Like boring descriptive words are what I want. I don't want Cyber Ninjas.
No.
But okay, beyond just the name, they've never done an audit before. No experience with this. It was also awarded without having like a bid process.
Not competitive.
Where like multiple agencies or multiple firms, companies are submitting bids, being like, well, here's what it'll cost for us to do this. Here's how we'll do it. No, and no one has really been able to give a good answer as to why President Fain, the president of the Arizona Senate, hired Cyber Ninjas. And in fact, the Democratic Secretary of State recently released a report about the audit and everything that's gone wrong with it. And she's like, we have no, it remains unclear how Fan chose Cyber Ninjas. Yeah, and I guess Cyber Ninjas agreed to charge the Senate $150,000, but then it's been raising money separately from that. So it's not like it's actually the total cost is likely to exceed $9 million now. So it's like they clearly didn't have some actual way to do this audit. And there have been a bunch of just small things noted that are just totally off about this. So initially, only One American News Network, which is a television network that helped to organize and fund the review, was granted access. So One American News Network, which is not a news network at all, but a right-wing propaganda network that pushes out a bunch of far-right conspiracy theories and has been doing that for the last few years at least. They are are, one, they're helping to fund this review, like raising money for it, and two, they were initially the only news network allowed to like see the proceedings. Now there was litigation, other news networks were let in after that. And then there are other things, like they noted that ballot counters were using both black and blue pens, which is never done in an election audit. You use typically red pens. And the reason is that black and blue pens are what they use to mark the ballots. And so someone could fill out a bubble accidentally or intentionally on one of those ballots, and they have then committed voter fraud. And so you always use red pens or some other type of ink that isn't read by the machines and that is different than what's used on election day, so that any markings made by the ballot counters can be viewed and you know they're separate. And there are just tons of things that they did that were not what you would hope for or expect from an audit. They didn't have, good like security or like chain of custody. There's some evidence that voting system data was sent to a company in Montana, and there's no indication of how that data was secured or why it was sent to Montana. There were not, reliable policies, processes, procedures set up in that. And yeah, there's a whole like nearly 50-page document that was put out by the Secretary of State, basically just criticizing how this audit has been conducted. It's now September. The audit was originally supposed to take 60 days, and I think it started in like March or something like that, March or April, because it didn't start right away, because right away they were doing the original like normal review processes you would do. It's now taken more than double that time, and they were supposed to have a report a few days ago, but they had to delay it because multiple auditors got sick with COVID.
This sounds like a racket to me. So did any of the official like review process for the election turn up any voter fraud in Arizona?
No,
I'm shocked.
Nor has this audit either. I mean, they haven't put out the report. There were some instances where they claimed like, oh, this looks amiss. Like there was something where they were like, well, the number of ballots returned was greater than the number of ballots sent out. But what was actually happening is that the number they were looking at was both early votes and absentee votes. They were not separated at that point. So they were saying, well, the number of ballots sent out is smaller than the number of votes we have. And that's because numerous votes were never sent out. People came into an early voting center and cast them in person.
What a bunch of morons.
Yeah, so it's like they put that out as like, oh, we think we found something. Everyone, jumped on that as like, no, here's what actually happened. And then eventually even the like auditors themselves were like, okay, I guess you were wrong about that. So yeah, so clearly this is not how you would run a ballot audit if you wanted to actually get correct results. And it's important to note a forensic audit of ballot tabulation equipment used in 2020 was completed in January by the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. And that, among other investigations, along with their pre- and post-election logic and accuracy tests, all of that comes together where they're like, yeah, we are very confident that all of these systems worked as expected. And so you might think, this audit in Arizona is going off the rails. It's crazy. It's clearly not going to get any accurate results. So at least it's just going to be this weird one-time thing in Arizona. But both Republicans in Wisconsin and Republicans in Pennsylvania are looking at trying to do similar audits. So the Assembly in Wisconsin voted just in the last couple weeks to spend nearly $700,000 in taxpayer money to investigate last November's election. And that was a vote by the Republicans, who only control that chamber because of gerrymandering, as we talked about on our last episode. And a similar push is happening in Pennsylvania as well right now. And in fact, I know some of the senators in Pennsylvania who are leading that have actually met with, I believe, both cyber ninjas and some of the Arizona senators to be like, oh, let's model our audit off of that great success. We also saw Donald Trump himself talk with the chair of the GOP, I believe, in Michigan about pushing for an audit there.
That is insane. It's absolutely insane. And, I think we probably should talk briefly about this. Seems so ridiculous, right? Like, clearly voter fraud is not real. There's like a really strong push by Republican news organizations, Donald Trump and his supporters, and the Republican Party, especially in the House and also in the Senate, to really tell this pervasive lie, the big lie, that the election was stolen, that there was all this fraud. When the election in 2020 ended up being not so close, it's easy to look back at all of these things in isolation and see like, well, these are scams and fraudulence and like blatant political attempts at consolidating power and spreading misinformation. But had this election in 2020 ended up being closer between Trump and Biden, like if it had come down to one state or even two states, you could really see how some of these claims of voter fraud could have ended up being really dangerous, with a 6-3 Republican majority on the Supreme Court and like state legislatures' willingness to talk about like electing their own slate of electors to go. But like this could have gone really wrong. And it can still go really wrong, right? Like these lies are pernicious and pervasive and are just settling, into a large percentage of our voter base believe that there was some level of fraud in the 2020 election, especially in the Republican Party. So what can we actually do if we want to reduce voter fraud and increase security in our elections moving forward?
So there are a number of things one could do if your priority is to increase the security of an election without undermining its legitimacy, without engaging in voter suppression, those sorts of things. So they include one, as I mentioned before, having paper ballots so that you can't have your election machines hacked and the results changed that way, having regular recount processes, investing heavily in cybersecurity for elections. And then also there's what's called risk limiting audits, which are a way of just checking that the computer tallies in an election are accurate. And so basically involves just storing all the ballots and then manually comparing a statistical sample every time to what the final results are. And a lot of these things are already done, at least in parts of the United States. Like we talked about, we've actually had good success increasing the number of paper ballots used, with 95% of ballots being paper in 2020. But what you'll see is that none of those things are the things that Republicans are pushing for. They're not in a lot of these laws, like in Texas, Georgia, Arizona, that have been passed to change their voting systems this year. They're not being addressed by, the audits that are being done. And so what that tells me, and what it should tell anyone, is that these are not about a genuine fear of voter fraud and trying to find ways to minimize voter fraud. The reason that you hear so much about voter fraud is for two main reasons. One is Donald Trump himself and his desire to use these claims to overturn the results of the election, which he very clearly tried to do. And we'll probably talk more about this in future episodes in more detail. But he not only claimed voter fraud, he, had that conversation with the Georgia Secretary of State, asking him to find 11,000 votes. There was January 6th, where he organized his supporters to literally disrupt the certification of the election. He put a lot of pressure on Mike Pence to try and get him to reject the electors from some of the swing states. He tried to get Republican officials to not certify election results, to send their own slates of electors. All of these are things he talked about or attempted to do. And like you said before, if the election results had been even closer, or he had just gotten a little bit luckier with some Republicans, it's like, who knows what could have happened? And then two, relatedly but separately, Republicans need the lie that voter fraud is substantial in order to justify voter suppression. Because if voter fraud is common, it does make it a lot more reasonable for you to do things like have voter ID requirements. Now, voter ID is not like the best way in any circumstance to stop voter fraud from happening, but it can, stop some forms of voter fraud in some very limited instances. And so if voter fraud is happening at a high level, it becomes a lot more reasonable to implement that policy. But if you recognize the reality that voter fraud is not happening, then anything you do around voter ID, around limiting voting hours, voting drop boxes, limiting vote by mail, no longer can you claim it's about protecting the election, limiting voter fraud. You can only be revealed to be suppressing the vote, trying to make it harder for Americans to vote. So that is why you hear so much about voter fraud. And it also, again, shows that Republicans, even more than the mainstream media, would love to find a clear-cut case of voter fraud at a large level done by Democrats. That would be their holy grail if they could find something like that. But despite a 5-year investigation by the Bush administration, a 1-year investigation by the Trump administration, and numerous investigations by state and local officials, including secretaries of state and attorneys general,
and cyber ninjas
that are Republicans, and the Arizona Senate and their cyber ninjas contractor, they haven't ever found any evidence of that in the last few decades. Yeah, so thanks for listening, everybody. I hope this gave you a little bit more insight into why you hear so much about voter fraud, the reality of voter fraud, and the fact that it's really not happening. And if you enjoyed this episode, we strongly encourage you to subscribe, leave us a like and a comment, and we will see you in a couple weeks.